Hey, Business 101. Hey, so good to chat with you. This is the last week of our semester. We're coming up on finals, and so this video is intended as a review for your final exam. I do want to remind you before we even climb into the meat and potatoes of this video that if you have any assignments outstanding that you haven't turned in, you haven't had a chance, the time has slipped away, etc., etc. I understand how those things happen, but I do want to encourage you one last time, please, if you have the time, this week is the week to get all your back assignments turned in and submitted for partial credit, because the way that the grading works in this class, if you don't turn in written assignments, it really causes some significant impact upon your final grade. So just another nudge, another encouragement. If you can finish this semester strong, it will really pay off for you in your grade. Alrighty, so now when we talk about the final exam for this class will cover modules 11, 12, and 13. Those are the primary modules that are covered in this exam. Of course, these are the modules that we released after the second midterm exam, right? So there will be a handful of stray questions from previous content, but primarily the focus modules 11, 12, and 13. And just to let you know, this exam is intended, of course, to be taken entirely on Canvas, just like your first two midterms. It is comprised of 55 questions worth 70 possible points, and you will have 2.5 hours to complete the exam. And 2.5 hours also, you can think of it as 150 minutes, either way, okay? So that being said then, let's climb right into content that you will need to know to do well on the exam, alrighty? Module 11, as you may remember, was on information technology. What are the kinds of things that you will need to be conversant in? You'll need to know just sort of the introduction of IT, the main components, fundamentals like hardware versus software, how the systems are put together, just the general stuff that's in that module. You'll also need to take a good hard look at that section in the text on management information systems and decision support systems. So once you've got the basis of a network and a system, how are those systems actually used on behalf of business today? There is some basic discussion about privacy and security that you should be aware of. And of course, when we talk about IT security, you will need to be able to distinguish, for instance, what's a firewall, what are the big 5 pieces of IT security. And that also means that you'll need to be able to distinguish terms like different types of malware, right? Like viruses, worms, trojans, spam. How are those things different from one another? You should be aware of that, so study up on that, right? And then really the big thing out of this, I think, that you should be able to think about and discuss intelligently is the idea that, you may remember I gave you the big 5 principles of IT security, right? And that wasn't necessarily described in the text. This is what actual industry practitioners, folks who do IT security for a living, what they have always said is the big 5 things you got to nail down for the sake of IT security. Now, when you think about those big 5, you should notice that of those 5, 2 of them are focusing on the people, not on the technology. And of course, that's because, the chain is only as strong as the weakest link, and always the weakest link in IT security is not the hardware, it's not even the software, it's the human beings sitting behind the keyboard, right? And so you should be able to consider and think for a moment, what is really the implications of the fact that of the big 5 principles of IT security, 2 of them focus on people, not on technology, okay? So I hope that's helpful. Alrighty. But really, as I look at the exam, there aren't that many questions on the exam from Module 11. Most of them come from, Module 12 and 13, and that's where we climb in now. Module 12, on the topic of accounting, there's a lot of questions on the exam from Module number 12. So what do you need to know from the module on accounting? Well, you should know the basic definition of accounting. What is it? Why does it exist? What's it trying to accomplish? What is the difference, for instance, between bookkeeping versus accounting? How is accounting used? Right, so a great deal of that introductory material just to give you a context for the larger discussion. What are standard practices in accounting? What is generally accepted accounting principles? What does that refer to? What are the different categories of accounting, right? As well as, you know, some basic principles of what's an audit? And why is Sarbanes-Oxley so important? And what does that mean for us? Those are all, you know, in that earlier, that first half of the discussion of the topic of accounting. You will need to know also the accounting equation. Remember the accounting equation, right? Assets equals liabilities plus equity. Well, that's the equation itself, which means you will also need to be able to distinguish what are the definitions of those terms. What does that mean, assets? What are liabilities and what is equity? But then even going further, you should be able to speak intelligently to the purpose of the accounting equation. We realize, of course, that it's an equation, which means assets always has to equal what's on the other side. But really, what is that principle? What is the principle of the accounting equation trying to examine and analyze, right? What does it mean if a company has on the right-hand side of the equation, right, an enormous amount of liabilities and very little equity? Or for the same total amount, what does it mean if a great amount of equity and very small amount of liabilities? What does that mean about that company? You should be able to discuss that as well. All right. Also, what does it mean that just in general, when we say that accounting, when we're talking about financial accounting, that numbers are stories in disguise? You should remember that whole discussion and the principle behind it, what it's really trying to ask us to consider, right? Those are really big topics in this module that you'll have more than a few questions on. And then another big topic in Module 12 when it talks about accounting is the whole topic of financial statements. You should know what the standard financial statements are: an income statement, balance sheet, statement of cash flows, right, those kinds of things. And also the typical ways that we analyze financial statements with ratio analysis. You should be familiar with the basic ratios that you are asked to work through in that chapter, as well as the equation for working capital. Those are the big stuff in this module on accounting. Hopefully that is helpful for you, right? And then finally, at least in terms of new modules, Module 13, which of course is the most recent module, you should be pretty familiar with it, right? So this Module 13 on finance, right? You should know the purpose and the goal of finance and the financial system. What's it there for? What's it trying to accomplish? Okay, and just a hint, the purpose of the financial system is not to enrich the 1% and increase the gap between the haves and have-nots. Okay, so don't put that as an answer. That's not why the financial system exists. All right, so you should be conversant in the whole idea of how does a company raise capital. They have choices, right? They have a couple of choices. Debt versus equity financing. You should be able to discuss that. What is the difference between debt and equity financing? And when we talk about that, right? When we talk about debt, what is a corporate bond? What's a municipal bond? What's that all about, right? When we talk about companies getting capital through borrowing versus selling something, right? Issuing stock. Typically, we talk about in initial public offering, an IPO. What does that mean? What is going on there? What is a company doing to raise capital that way, right? From an investment perspective, you should know what is diversification and why we balance out risk versus return. Those are very important principles when we talk about investing, right? You should know who the SEC is. Who is the Securities and Exchange Commission? Why do they exist? What do they do, right? But maybe the biggest concept in Module 13 is the whole idea of the time value of money, or as we put it in this class, money never sleeps. So what does that really mean? What is the principle of compound growth? Why has that been called the eighth wonder of the world? Why is that so important? All right, so that's all stuff that you should be fairly familiar with just from having last done Module 13 on finance. All right. What kinds of stuff will you see from previous chapters? Well, primarily a couple of topics. One is we discussed at length, right, the difference between producing goods versus producing services. I remember talking about that first in the operations module and then a little bit when it came to marketing. So you should be familiar with that. And then finally, the last big topic has to do with leadership, right? Modules 8 and 9, leadership types, leadership terms, leading and motivating people, right? All of that stuff you should probably be very familiar with for the sake of this exam, all right? So that's the big stuff you're going to see in this final exam that will be released next week. I'll have more details on exactly what days, what times, how many days the exam will be open. All of that will be posted as an announcement. But for this video, I want you to at least get a sense of the kinds of topics you'll need to be fully up to speed with to do really, really well on the final exam. All right, so I wish you the very best of luck on the final exam, and thank you so much for your time in this course during this semester. It's been really great having you and seeing you guys consider these topics and grow in your understanding of business. I really do hope that you find this useful in your life, your job, and your career, and wish you all the best. All right, thanks so much. We'll see you possibly in the next class.